The meta. One of the most debated topics in not only the Tide community, but across gaming in general. No matter what game and what genre you pick, there will always be a meta that evolves whose sole purpose is to make it easier to win the game. And while it's very easy to understand why people create and adhere to metas, it always brings up a reoccurring question. How much does the meta matter in the first place? When talking about PvP games of any genre, the answer is obviously a lot. But when the topic at hand shifts to PvE games, the answer gets much less clear. Both Darktide and Vermintide have very clear-cut metas that numerically are superior than the rest, but if you spend any significant amount of time with these games, you might discover the truth about the meta of Darktide and Vermintide. Before we even begin to dissect the truth about the meta, let's make one thing clear. There is nothing wrong with adhering to a meta of any kind. If you want the best chance at victory, then it makes perfect sense that you would adhere to Darktide or Vermintide's meta. And the truth of the matter is that every single person in this community, myself included, has at one point or another decided to play with something they knew was meta because they wanted to win. The problem with the meta, though, is when you treat it as an infallible thing and use it as an excuse to be rude and speak down to other people. This kind of mindset about the meta doesn't help anyone because the meta in a game like Darktide and Vermintide is not as cut and dry as it is in other games. The meta in PvP games are more static due to the fact that you are playing against other people who can and will use it against you, and if you don't run the meta, you probably won't stand a chance to win whatsoever. Meta in the Tide games, though, is very fluid, primarily due to the fact that there can be more than one meta in existence at a time. This is because weapons and talents are specifically designed and balanced in such a way to grant the freedom of choice, and prevent situations where players feel as if they have to run one specific thing in order to win the game. And because of this, multiple weapons, builds, and talents often end up being meta at once and are equally as effective. On top of this, there is what I like to call the reverse difficulty dilemma. Some things that are meta in higher difficulties are not meta in lower difficulties because they're no longer good once the difficulty drops. This is a topic I can make an entire video on, but the result of this is that different difficulties often have different metas, and you cannot expect everyone to know every meta for every difficulty, let alone have the required resources to make a meta gear from the bad crafting system. Also, for clarity's sake, let's define exactly what I mean by meta, using the most effective and optimized build in order to achieve the highest success rate possible. In other games, meta can sometimes be used to refer to effective tactics or macro gameplay styles, but in Darktide, when people reference the meta, they mean the build you are using, more specifically what weapons and talents you are using. Anyway, the meta in the Tide games can really be split into two different types or styles of meta. First are the hard metas. These metas evolve when something becomes so unbelievably good you have to run it, or so unbelievably bad it's actually considered meta to not run it. We saw a hard meta in Darktide when the game first launched on Veteran with their power swords, back when they were so powerful nothing even came close to beating them. At the same time, we also saw a hard meta with the recon lasguns, just at the opposite end of the spectrum, with them being so bad you could not ever justify running one. We've also seen hard metas a few times in Vermintide, the most notable ones being on-release Moonbow and on-release Sword and Shield. Hard metas are the product of poor balance on Fat Shark's part and are not meant to last, which is why we never see a hard meta evolve. Just little pockets of them here and there before they're snuffed out, partially because Fat Shark tends to overdo it in the nerf department sometimes. The other kind of meta is a soft meta, which is where the game strives to be balance-wise at all times. Soft metas are when specific weapons or builds are still numerically superior to others, but not to the point where other builds cannot compete with them. As of right now, Darktide is currently filled with various soft metas. The Antax Combat Axe, the Mark IV Devil's Claw Sword, the Mark IV Dueling Sword, the Agrippina Braced Autogun, These weapons are all better than their counterparts, but not so much that they invalidate the other options in the game. Soft metas are the best kind of metas to have because they're the best of both worlds. They give people who want to follow a meta something to use, and allow people who don't want to follow a meta to run whatever they want and give them a reason to do so. This is important because it grants the ability for people to use these slightly weaker builds and compensate for their weaknesses, most notably through easier difficulties and personal skill level. Because of this ability to compensate, it is not mandatory to run the meta in either Darktide or Vermintide. It's typically more difficult to justify not playing a hard meta because of how much better it is than the other options, but that does not mean that you must run it to do well, and the same goes even more so for soft metas. The beauty of the Tide games is that all weapons and talents are balanced in such a way that you can play whatever you want in whatever difficulty as long as you have the skill to back it up, and if you don't, you can just easily drop the difficulty until you do. Even in orc missions where the game is much more difficult, as long as you have the skill and game knowledge to back up your build, you can pretty much do whatever you want and do just fine. This is a huge reason why myself and many other longtime players play for such a long time, as the ability to get to a point where you can use whatever and however you want not only makes for a good incentive to get good at the game, but it also opens up the potential for thousands upon thousands of hours of playtime between different builds, playstyles, and experimentation. So here's a message to any new players potentially watching this video. If you are struggling to make it through a certain difficulty, there is absolutely nothing wrong with using something considered meta, good, or best in slot to help you. I just want you to know that despite what people might tell you, you don't always have to adhere to whatever the best may be 100% of the time. Thanks for watching, and thanks to this month's Patreons for their continued support. Make sure to like and subscribe for more Darktide videos like this in the future. See y'all next time.